Snow fell slowly over the small machine shop on the outskirts of Granby, Colorado, on the morning of January 15, 1942. The sound of the wind cut through the silence of the Rocky Mountains, but inside that wood and metal shed, another sound dominated. The creak of tools against steel, the sigh of a lit blowtorch, the rhythmic tapping of a hammer against rusted sheet metal. There, among abandoned parts and disassembled engines, a man worked alone. His name was Marvin Eugene Heemeyer, 28 years old, a civilian mechanic born on a farm in rural South Dakota. His brown hair was always slick with grease, his hands were calloused, and his gaze was fixed and calculating. He wasn't fixing an engine. He was building something no one had asked for, something no one had imagined possible. The United States had officially entered World War II just a month earlier, after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The entire country was mobilizing. Factories converted production lines for tanks and airplanes. Men enlisted by the thousands. Women took up positions in arsenals. But Marvin hadn't been drafted. A problem with his left knee, detected during his medical examination. Unfit for active duty. The refusal came on letterhead, signed by an officer who barely glanced at him. Marvin tucked the folded document into his overalls pocket and returned to the workshop. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He just thought, if I can't go to war, I'll bring it here. The idea was born of quiet frustration, but it grew, fueled by something more dangerous, unsupervised ingenuity. Marvin knew how to weld, how to cut steel, how to calculate torque and material resistance. He had access to industrial scrap, discarded armor plates from train cars, and abandoned railroad tracks. And he had time, lots of time. Over the next few days, he began sketching, not on paper, but in his head. He visualized every part, every angle, every joint. The project was simple in essence, but audacious in execution. Transform a Caterpillar 60 agricultural tractor into a functional armored vehicle, capable of withstanding rifle fire and carrying enough weight to mount a .30 caliber machine gun on top. He started with the chassis. The Caterpillar 60 was a robust machine used for plowing fields and pulling heavy implements. It had a 6-cylinder diesel engine, wide steel tracks and a reinforced front axle. Marvin dismantled the original hood, removed the open cab, and began welding armor plates around the frame. The plates came from a scrapyard 20 miles away, where freight cars were dismantled. Each plate was between 12 and 18 millimeters thick. He cut them with a blowtorch, adjusted them with a sledgehammer, and welded them with low-alloy electrodes. The process was slow. Every weld needed to be tested. Every joint needed to withstand pressure. Marvin was in no hurry. He worked at night with a lamp hanging from the ceiling and a pot of coffee by his side. The transformation took weeks. The tractor began to disappear beneath layers of steel. The tracks were partially covered by armored skirts. The engine was insulated with additional plates to protect the radiator and fuel tank. Marvin built an enclosed cab with no windows, just narrow slits for visibility. Inside he installed a leather seat taken from an old truck, a reinforced steering lever, and a makeshift dashboard with temperature and oil pressure gauges. Ventilation was poor. The heat would be unbearable in the summer. But Marvin didn't care. This wasn't comfort. It was function. The most complex part came next, the rotating turret. Marvin welded a circular platform to the top of the cab, supported by bearings salvaged from an industrial forklift. The platform could rotate 360 degrees, manually operated by an internal lever. On it, he attached a steel mount capable of carrying a Browning M1919A4 .30 caliber machine gun, which he had purchased from a collector in Denver for $150. The weapon was non-functional. It was missing its firing mechanism, and the barrel was worn. But Marvin didn't intend to shoot it. He just wanted it to look real, to intimidate, to force people to look and think, this exists. When he finished on a cold February morning, Marvin stepped out of the workshop and stared at his creation in the moonlight. The tractor was gone. In its place was a lump of raw steel, angular, asymmetrical, but undeniably functional. He climbed into the cab and started the engine. The diesel's roar echoed across the mountains. The tracks creaked against the frozen ground. Marvin advanced 10 feet, stopped, and turned the turret. Everything worked. He turned off the engine and sat there in the dark, breathing slowly. There was no pride on his face, only the certainty that he had proven something. To himself, to the country that rejected him, to the war that continued without him. But the story of Marvin Heemeyer and his makeshift tank was just beginning, and what he did next would change the way small-town America saw the line between ingenuity and menace. The news spread slowly, like everything else that winter of 1942. First it was the closest neighbors, farmers who passed by on the dirt road and heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine coming from Marvin's workshop. Then it was the owner of the Granby General Store, who heard from a customer about the homemade tank the strange mechanic was building. People laughed. They thought it was an exaggeration, country folklore. But when Marvin finally decided to test his creation in the open field on February 23rd, everything changed. He chose an abandoned lot 3 miles from town, a former disused quarry surrounded by pine trees and rocks. It was Sunday. The sky was clear, but the cold bit his skin. Marvin drove the armored tractor along the country road at a slow speed, about 5 miles per hour. The tracks scraped the frozen asphalt, leaving deep tracks. 2 boys on bicycles saw him pass and pedaled into town to count them. In less than an hour, there were 15 people at the quarry waiting. Marvin didn't speak to anyone. He got out of the vehicle, checked the oil level, adjusted the track tension, and returned to the cab. He started the engine. The diesel roared. He drove straight up a dirt and rock ramp. The vehicle's weight was absurd, over 4 tons with full armor. The tracks sank into the ground, but didn't lose traction. Marvin continued climbing until he reached the top of the ramp, turned the turret 90 degrees to the left, and descended the opposite side. The Caterpillar's suspension wasn't designed for that. The tractor rocked and creaked, but didn't tip over. Marvin repeated the movement 3 times, always silently, always focused. When he stopped, he turned off the engine and got out. People applauded. He didn't smile. He just nodded and walked away. But that test had consequences. The following Monday, 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up at Marvin's shop. They didn't knock. They walked right in, identified themselves, and asked to see the vehicle. Marvin led them to the warehouse. The agents examined the armor, measured the plates with a tape measure, and photographed the rotating turret and the dummy machine gun. They asked questions. Where did the materials come from? Who financed the construction? What was the purpose? Marvin answered calmly. He said everything was purchased legally, that there was no purpose other than to prove he could do it, that the weapon didn't work. The agents wrote everything down, thanked them, and left. Marvin stood there, staring at the open door. He knew it wouldn't end that way, and it wasn't over. 3 days later, a U.S. Army officer arrived in town. Captain Howard Bennett, 32nd, a West Point-trained military engineer assigned to inspect civilian projects that could have military applications. He got straight to the point. He sat down with Marvin in the workshop, without formality, and said, "You've built something impressive, but you've also built something dangerous, and the government needs to know if it can be replicated." Marvin crossed his arms. He didn't respond immediately. Bennett continued. He explained that the country was mobilizing all available industrial capacity, that light tanks like the M3 Stuart were being mass-produced, but there was a shortage of skilled labor for field modifications, that mechanics like Marvin, with the ability to improvise armor and repair pressure equipment, were valuable. He offered a contract, 3 months of training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, followed by assignment to an armored vehicle maintenance unit in Europe. Salary triple what he was earning in the shop. Guaranteed lodging. Marvin listened to everything, then he simply said, "No." Bennett frowned. "Why?" Marvin glanced at the armored tractor, covered by a tarp, at the back of the shed. "Because I built this to prove I can, not to be told what to do with it." Bennett was silent. He understood. He didn't agree, but he understood. He stood up, left a card with a phone number, and said the offer would remain open for 2 weeks. Then he left. Marvin didn't care, but the officer's presence changed something in town. People began to look at him differently, some with respect, others with suspicion. The local sheriff, a 54-year-old man named Clayton Morris, a World War I veteran, stopped by the shop and left a warning. "I know you haven't done anything illegal, but if that tank leaves here and scares anyone, I'll have to act." Marvin nodded. He made no promises. And then, one March night, something unexpected happened. A fire broke out in the Granby hardware store, 300 yards from the workshop. The flames grew quickly, fueled by dry lumber and stored varnish. The town's volunteer fire department had only an old truck with a hand pump and short hoses. It wouldn't be enough. The fire threatened to spread to neighboring buildings. That's when Marvin showed up, driving the armored tractor down Main Street, 2 barrels of water strapped to the sides, and a makeshift hose connected to a hand pump he'd rigged on the back. He positioned the vehicle between the burning warehouse and the pharmacy next door, used the armor as a heat barrier, and began pumping water. The system was rudimentary, the pressure low, but it worked. Marvin stood there for 40 minutes, inside the stifling cabin, pumping water as the flames receded. When the fire was under control, he turned off the engine, got out, and drove away. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't give interviews. He simply returned to the shop, parked the tractor, and closed the door. The next morning, the whole town knew. The crazy mechanic, the man who built a tank out of stubbornness, had saved half of Granby's shopping street. And that changed everything, because now, for the first time, people didn't just see eccentricity. They saw usefulness. They saw courage. They saw something even the army hadn't been able to see, that sometimes ingenuity is born of disobedience. The story of the fire transformed Marvin Heemeyer into something he never wanted to be, a public figure. In the following days, local newspapers published short stories about the mechanic who used a homemade armored tractor to fight the flames. The Rocky Mountain News sent a reporter to Granby, but Marvin refused an interview. The man stood at the shop door for 20 minutes, insisting, until Marvin simply closed the door and wouldn't open it again. He didn't want fame. He just wanted to be left to work in peace. But peace would not come. In mid-April 1942, a telegram arrived at the workshop. Sender, United States War Department. Content: a formal request for Marvin Eugene Heemeyer to attend a technical meeting in Denver on April 22nd to demonstrate his improvised armor techniques to a committee of military engineers. Attendance was voluntary, but strongly encouraged. Marvin read the telegram 3 times, folded it, and put it in a drawer. He did not respond. On the 22nd, he was in the shop, as usual. At 9 in the morning, a black Ford Deluxe pulled up in front of the warehouse. 3 men in dark suits and an army officer got out. The officer was the same as before, Captain Howard Bennett. He didn't look angry, just tired. Bennett entered the shop, found Marvin welding a suspension part, and waited until he finished. When the torch went out, Bennett said, "You didn't come." Marvin took off his goggles. "I didn't want to go." Bennett sighed. "Marvin, you don't understand. What you've done here isn't just ingenuity. It's field innovation. The kind of thing that could save lives out there. In Tunisia, our tanks are being destroyed by German guns because their frontal armor can't hold up. Mechanics like you could reinforce those plates in the field without having to send the vehicles back to the factory. You could teach that." Marvin wiped his hands on an old rag. "I'm not a teacher. I'm a mechanic." Bennett crossed his arms. "Then be a mechanic, but be where you're needed." Marvin glanced at the armored tractor, parked in the corner of the warehouse, still sooty from the fire. "If I go, I'll do it my way. No uniform, no hierarchy, no orders that don't make sense." Bennett shook his head. "It doesn't work that way." Marvin went back to welding. "Then it doesn't work." The men in suits watched the conversation in silence. One of them, older, with gray hair and round glasses, stepped forward. He identified himself as Douglas Whitman, chief engineer at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, responsible for field modifications to armored vehicles. He spoke calmly, without trying to intimidate. "Marvin, can I see your blueprints?" Marvin looked at him. Whitman didn't have Bennett's military bearing. He seemed genuinely curious. Marvin nodded. The two spent the next hour examining the tractor. Whitman asked technical questions: plate thickness, weld type, angle of inclination of the front armor, weight distribution. Marvin answered precisely. He explained how he calculated the strength of each joint, how he reinforced the front axle to support the additional weight, how he insulated the engine to prevent overheating. Whitman took out a notebook and began sketching. He asked if he could photograph some of the welds. Marvin agreed. When they finished, Whitman put away his notebook and said, "You have talent, but talent without direction is wasted." Marvin didn't respond. Whitman continued, "I won't try to convince you to enlist, but I will leave you with a proposal. If you ever change your mind, come see me. I can guarantee you'll work alone, without direct supervision, with only clear objectives. You choose how to solve problems. No one questions your methods." Whitman left a business card on the counter. "Think about it." They left. Marvin stood there alone, staring at the card. He thought of Pearl Harbor. He thought of the men dying in Africa and the Pacific while he welded scrap metal in Colorado. He thought of the knee that had prevented him from going. He thought of the refusal. He thought of the tractor. He put the card in his pocket and went back to work. The following weeks were uneventful. Marvin returned to his routine, repairing tractors, welding implements, tuning engines, but something had changed. He began listening to the radio while working, something he never did. News reports about the Japanese advance in the Pacific, fighting in Burma, bombing raids on England. Every night before bed, he would take Whitman's card from his pocket and read the address. Rock Island Arsenal, Illinois, Field Engineer Department. On May 15, 1942, Marvin closed the shop indefinitely. He posted a sign on the door, "Closed, return uncertain." He covered the armored tractor with a thick tarp, double-locked the shed and took the train to Illinois. He took only a suitcase of clothes, a toolbox, and Whitman's card. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't say goodbye. He simply left. When he arrived at Rock Island Arsenal 3 days later, Whitman was waiting at the station. He didn't seem surprised. He simply shook Marvin's hand and said, "Welcome." Marvin looked at the industrial complex in the distance. Immense warehouses, smoking chimneys, hundreds of men working. He didn't know it yet, but this place would change his life, and his ideas would change the way the U.S. Army armored its vehicles on the battlefield, because Marvin Heemeyer hadn't gone to war, but war had finally come to him. The Rock Island Arsenal occupied nearly 1,500 acres on the banks of the Mississippi River, between Illinois and Iowa. It was one of the largest military-industrial facilities in the United States, operating since 1863. In May of 1942, the site was abuzz with wartime activity. Foundries operated around the clock. Assembly lines churned out howitzers and armored vehicle chassis. Engineers tested prototype weapons in open fields, surrounded by barbed wire. Marvin arrived on a hot afternoon, the sound of jackhammers echoing among the corrugated metal warehouses. Douglas Whitman took him directly to Pavilion 17, a massive hangar where damaged tanks were analyzed and rebuilt. There were 7 vehicles there, 3 M3 Stuart tanks with turrets pierced by German anti-tank shells, 2 M3 Semi-Orugos with torn side armor, an M7 Priest self-propelled gun with its engine compartment destroyed by fire, and an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer with its front plate cracked after a direct hit. Marvin stopped in front of the Wolverine. He observed the crack in the armor, ran his hand over the deformed metal and simply said, "This shouldn't have happened." Whitman crossed his arms. "I agree, but it happened, and it will happen again. Our vehicles are being sent to North Africa with inadequate armor. The Germans use PaK 38 and 88mm cannons. Our Stuarts and Wolverines weren't designed to withstand that. By the time they're back for repairs, we've already lost crews. We need quick, field-applicable solutions without having to send the vehicles back to Detroit or here." Marvin continued examining the Wolverine. "How much time do I have?" Whitman smiled. "As long as you need, but the sooner the better." Marvin spent the next 3 days studying each damaged vehicle. He took measurements, recorded impact angles, and calculated the projectile's penetration energy. He identified the weak points: poorly executed welded joints, insufficient plate thickness in critical areas, and a lack of slope in the frontal armor. On the 4th day, he requested access to the materials store. Whitman authorized it. Marvin set aside 25mm steel plates, cut railroad tracks, structural reinforcement bars, and high-strength electrodes. Then he locked himself in Pavilion 17 and began work. The first project was the damaged Wolverine. Marvin removed the cracked front plate, cut a new plate at a 45-degree angle, and welded it onto the original structure, creating a double layer of armor. The welding was done in multiple passes, alternating low and high alloy electrodes to prevent metal embrittlement. Then he reinforced the turret's sides with sections of railroad track, distributing the weight so as not to compromise the rotating turret's mobility. It took him 6 days. When finished, he called Whitman. The engineer examined the work in silence. He measured the thickness, tested the tightness of the welds, and checked the turret alignment. Then he ordered a ballistics test. The modified Wolverine was taken to the Arsenal's firing range, positioned 100 meters away from a captured PaK 38 gun. 3 shots were fired at the frontal armor. The shells ricocheted, none penetrated. Whitman wrote down the results and looked at Marvin. "How did you know the slope would work?" Marvin dusted his hands. "Because the physics don't change. Slope increases effective thickness without adding weight. It's basic geometry." Word spread quickly. In the following days, other Arsenal engineers began showing up at Pavilion 17. They wanted to see Marvin's method. They wanted to replicate it. But Marvin didn't teach. He just demonstrated. He'd take a sheet metal plate, show the angle of the cut, weld it and say, "This is it." Some understood, others didn't. Whitman realized that Marvin had no patience for explaining theory. He was a man of execution, not of teaching. So Whitman changed his strategy. Instead of asking Marvin to teach, he asked him to solve specific problems. And the problems began to arrive. A lieutenant colonel from Armored Command brought photographs of destroyed Stuart tanks in Tunisia. He asked if it was possible to create add-on armor kits that could be installed by field mechanics without industrial equipment. Marvin studied the photos for 2 hours. Then he designed a system of modular plates, held together by bolts and welded clamps, that could be applied over the original armor without compromising the suspension. The prototype was ready in 10 days. It was sent for testing in the Arizona desert. It worked. Another problem arose from an artillery major. The M3 Semi-Arugas were vulnerable to German fragmentation grenades. The side armor was only 6 millimeters thick. Marvin proposed a simple solution: interlocking steel screens, fixed 30 centimeters from the original armor, creating an air layer that dispersed the energy of the explosions before they impacted the metal. The system was lightweight, inexpensive, and could be manufactured in any field workshop. It was immediately approved, but the most complex project came in July. A colonel on the general staff brought blueprints for a new tank destroyer under development, the M18 Hellcat. The vehicle would be the fastest in the American arsenal, capable of reaching 50 miles per hour, but would have minimal armor to keep its weight low. The problem: how to protect the crew without sacrificing speed. Marvin spent 2 weeks analyzing the design. His solution was radical: eliminate the heavy armor completely and focus on mobility and camouflage. He proposed replacing the steel plates with thinner laminated armor, compensating with an angular design that maximized ricochet. The idea was met with skepticism, but Whitman insisted on testing. The results proved Marvin right. By September 1942, 7 months after his arrival, Marvin Heemeyer had modified 19 vehicles, created 4 field armor systems, and indirectly trained dozens of military mechanics. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't respond to hierarchies. He worked alone irregular hours, sometimes until the wee hours. Whitman gave him free rein, and it worked. But Marvin knew that wouldn't last forever, because war was changing, and soon he would be forced to choose between remaining in the safety of the armory or going where his ideas truly mattered, the battlefield. The autumn of 1942 brought profound changes to the course of the war. In North Africa, Allied forces prepared for Operation Torch, the invasion of Morocco and Algeria. In Eastern Europe, the Battle of Stalingrad was turning into a grinder of human flesh and steel. In the Pacific, American Marines fought yard by yard on Guadalcanal. And at the Rock Island Arsenal, Marvin Heemeyer continued his silent work, increasingly aware that his technical solutions were not just abstract exercises. They were decisions that kept men alive or condemned them to death inside metal boxes riddled with shells. On October 23rd, Douglas Whitman entered Pavilion 17 with an expression Marvin had never seen before. It wasn't concern, it was urgency. He carried a brown leather briefcase tied with string and placed it on the workbench. "We need to talk," Whitman said. Marvin turned off the torch, removed his safety glasses, and waited. Whitman opened the briefcase and pulled out 3 black and white photographs, taken from different angles. They showed a German vehicle, low, wide, with a small turret and a long gun. Marvin recognized it immediately. Panzer IV with a long 75mm gun. Whitman nodded. "Exactly. And it's destroying our tanks in Tunisia. The Stuarts don't stand a chance. The Shermans are starting to arrive, but they're still few. We need something that can handle this now, not in 6 months." Marvin studied the photographs. The Panzer IV Model G was a formidable machine. Its 80mm frontal armor was sloped, heat-treated for increased hardness. The KWK-40 cannon could pierce any American armor at a distance of 1,000 meters. It was fast, reliable, and operated by experienced crews who had been fighting since 1939. Marvin placed the photographs back on the workbench. "You want me to find a way to stop this?" Whitman didn't hesitate. "Yes." Marvin walked to the pavilion window. Outside, a convoy of GMC trucks was unloading ammunition crates. The sky was overcast gray, foreboding of snow. He thought of the men who would be inside the tanks when they encountered those Panzer IVs. He thought of the sweltering desert heat, the dust seeping through the cracks, the sound of enemy cannons before impact. He thought of what it would be like to be trapped inside a Stuart, knowing its armor wasn't sufficient. He turned to Whitman. "I can't change physics. A Stuart will never have the armor to withstand a 75mm round. But I can change tactics." Whitman frowned. "Explain." Marvin returned to the bench, picked up a pencil, and began sketching on a sheet of paper. "The problem isn't just armor, it's doctrine. Our tanks are being used like the Germans used theirs, frontal combat, long-range firefights. But the Stuart wasn't built for that. It's fast, light, and has a turret that rotates faster than the Panzers. If we use that, we can turn the tide." He drew two vehicles, one from the front, the other from the side. The Panzer IV has 80mm at the front, but only 30 on the sides and 20 at the rear. If the Stuart attacks from the flanks, at high speed, it can pierce the side armor with its 37mm gun, but for that it needs extreme mobility and maneuverability in difficult terrain. Whitman leaned over the drawing. "Are you proposing we modify the Stuart to be even faster?" Marvin shook his head. "No, it's already fast. The problem is the suspension. On rough terrain, it loses traction. The tracks slip in sand and mud. It needs wider tracks with better weight distribution and reinforced suspension to absorb impacts without losing speed. Also, we need additional armor only on the sides, not the front. 15mm angled plates, enough to protect against heavy machine gun fire and shrapnel, but without adding weight that compromises mobility." Whitman thought silently. Then he looked at Marvin. "How long do you need to make a prototype?" Marvin looked around the pavilion. There were 2 damaged Stuarts awaiting repair. 3 weeks, maybe less. Whitman closed the folder. "You have 2. Armored Command wants to field test it by November 15th. If it works, we'll produce modification kits for all Stuart units in North Africa." Marvin didn't argue. He just nodded. The following days were the most intense since Marvin's arrival at the arsenal. He chose the least damaged Stuart, an M3A1 with an intact turret but a blown engine. He replaced the engine with a reconditioned Continental radial, adjusted the transmission to prioritize acceleration over maximum torque, and began work on the suspension. The original system used vertical springs that compressed under excessive weight. Marvin replaced it with a torsion bar arrangement, adapted from drawings he had seen in captured German technical manuals. The system was more complex, required precise machining, but offered superior shock absorption. Next came the track modifications. Marvin increased the width of each segment by 2 inches by welding on steel side extensions. This distributed the weight over a larger area, reducing ground pressure and improving traction in sand. He tested the system in an industrial sand tank inside the arsenal. The modified Stuart traversed dunes that would have previously caused it to get stuck. Whitman observed the test, took notes and authorized it to continue. The side armor came last. Marvin cut 15mm plates into a trapezoidal shape, inclined at 25 degrees. He attached them with brackets welded directly to the hull, creating a 10-centimeter gap between the original and additional armor. This gap acted as a buffer against grenade blasts. The overall weight increased by 450 kilograms, but the power-to-weight ratio still allowed for speeds in excess of 60 kilometers per hour on level ground. On the 14th day, the prototype was complete. Marvin painted a white stripe on the turret, temporary identification, and took it to the arsenal's proving grounds. Whitman was there, accompanied by 3 armored command officers, a colonel, a major, and a lieutenant. They didn't look optimistic. The colonel, a tall, grey-haired man named Arthur Preston, crossed his arms and said, "I hear you think you can turn a Stuart into a tank destroyer. Let's see." Marvin didn't respond. He simply climbed into the tank, started the engine, and began the test. First, straight-line speed. The modified Stuart reached 64 kilometers per hour on flat terrain, 2 miles faster than the stock version. Then came maneuvers. Marvin made sharp turns at high speed, controlled skids and sudden acceleration and braking. The suspension absorbed everything without losing stability. Then came the ultimate test, a course over rough terrain. The test field had a section with sand, mud, rocks and ramps. Marvin traversed it all at top speed. The Stuart didn't get stuck, didn't roll over, didn't lose traction. When he finished, Marvin turned off the engine and got out. Colonel Preston walked around the tank, examining the wide tracks, the side armor, the weld marks. Then he looked at Whitman. "It works, but I want a ballistics test." Fire on the sides. Whitman waved to a sergeant, who readied a .50 caliber Browning machine gun. 3 rounds were fired at the Stuart side armor. The shells ricocheted, they didn't penetrate. Preston nodded. I approved the production of the kits. How many can you make in a month? Marvin looked at Whitman. Whitman did a mental calculation. With the armory fully staffed, 200 kits, maybe more. Preston turned to leave. Make 300 and have them shipped to Casablanca by January. He stopped, looked at Marvin and said, Good job, civilian. Then he left. Marvin stood there beside the modified Stuart, the cold November wind blowing across the proving grounds. Whitman walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. You just changed the doctrine for deploying light tanks. You know that, don't you? Marvin looked toward the horizon. I just hope it works when it really matters. And it would work. But before that, Marvin Heemeyer would face a decision that would change his life forever. The choice between staying safe in the arsenal or boarding the first ship bound for North Africa to see for himself if his ideas would actually save lives. Winter arrived early at Rock Island Arsenal. In December of 1942, snow blanketed the industrial warehouses and the Mississippi River froze over its banks. Marvin Heemeyer spent his days supervising the production of modification kits for Stuart tanks. 317 units were manufactured in 6 weeks. Each kit contained wide tracks, side armor plates, mounting brackets, illustrated instructions, and a technical installation manual that Marvin handwrote page by page. The kits were packed in reinforced wooden crates, marked in black ink. Field modification, Heemeyer design, Rock Island Arsenal approved. On December 28th, the first crates were loaded onto train cars bound for New York Harbor. From there, they would travel by sea train to Casablanca, Morocco, where American armored units were preparing to face Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. Douglas Whitman watched the shipment, checking each crate, reviewing packing lists. Marvin stood beside him, silent, watching the cars depart under the light falling snow. Whitman turned to him. You should be proud. This will save lives. Marvin didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the tracks disappearing around the bend, swallowed by the fog. I won't know if it works until I'm there. Whitman frowned. Where? Marvin stared at him. North Africa. I want to see the tanks in combat. I want to be there when the mechanics install the kits. I want to know if what I designed actually works under live fire. Whitman shook his head. Marvin, you're a civilian. You can't just go into a war zone. You have no military training, no clearance, no... Marvin interrupted him. Then give me clearance. Hire me as a technical consultant. Send me as an observer. I don't care about the title. I just want to go. Whitman was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. I'll talk to Colonel Preston, but I'm not promising anything. 3 days later, Marvin was summoned to the Arsenal's administrative office. There he found Preston sitting behind a desk covered in maps and reports. The colonel wasted no time. Whitman told me you want to go to Tunisia. Is that true? Marvin nodded. Preston crossed his arms. You know you're not a soldier. You know you can't carry weapons. You know that if something goes wrong, we have no obligation to protect you. Marvin kept his gaze steady. I know, Preston thought. Then he opened a drawer, took out a typed form and placed it on the desk. Sign this. It's a civilian technical consultant contract with Armored Command. You'll go to Casablanca, then to the front, accompanying the units that receive your kits. Your job is to observe, adjust, and report. Nothing more. Got it? Marvin picked up a pen and signed without hesitation. On January 15, 1943, Marvin boarded a train for New York. He carried only a suitcase, basic tools, and a notebook. On January 20th, he boarded the transport ship USS Thomas Stone, which departed in convoy protected by destroyers. The voyage lasted 18 days. The seas were rough. Marvin spent most of his time on deck, gazing out at the grey, endless Atlantic, wondering what he would find on the other side. Casablanca was organized chaos. When Marvin disembarked on February 7th, the port was abuzz with activity. Trucks unloaded supplies, soldiers marched in formation, planes took off from makeshift runways. He was taken directly to an armored vehicle depot 20 kilometers from the city, where 50 Stuart tanks awaited modification. The military mechanics had already received the kits but didn't know where to begin. Marvin spent the next 3 days teaching, not with excessive words but with direct demonstration. He would pick up a tool, show the cutting angle, weld a plate and say, "This is it." The mechanics learned quickly. On February 23rd, The first modified Stuart entered combat near Kasserine, Tunisia. The unit was the first armoured division, facing elements of the German 10th Panzer Division. The report arrived 3 days later. The Stuart had flanked a Panzer IV, fired 6 37mm shells into the side, pierced the armour, and set the enemy tank on fire. The American crew emerged unharmed. The platoon commander wrote in his report, "Modification saved our lives. Request more kits." Over the next few months, the modified Stuarts proved their worth repeatedly, not as frontline tanks but as fast hunters, operating on flanks, destroying isolated vehicles, protecting convoys. Stuart losses fell by 28% in the units that received the kits. Marvin followed it all. He visited field workshops, talked to crews, fine-tuned details. In April, he was in a workshop near Tunis when a young lieutenant covered in oil and soot approached and said, "Are you Heemeyer, the guy who made this?" Marvin nodded. The lieutenant shook his hand tightly. "Thank you. My men are still alive because of your work." Marvin returned to the United States in June 1943, after the North African campaign ended with the surrender of the Axis forces. He didn't return to Granby. He returned to Rock Island. Whitman was waiting for him at the train station. They didn't say much. They simply walked to the arsenal where a new project awaited, improvements to the Sherman tank's armor for the invasion of Europe. Marvin accepted. He would work there until the end of the war in 1945, developing protection systems that would save hundreds of lives. After the war, Marvin returned to Granby. He reopened the shop. The armored tractor still stood there, covered in dust, untouched. He never spoke publicly about what he did during the war. He gave no interviews. He didn't write memoirs. He just kept repairing tractors, welding implements, working in silence. But veterans passing through town knew, and sometimes they stopped by the shop just to shake his hand. Marvin Eugene Heemeyer's story is a reminder that war isn't just about generals and epic battles. It's also about lone mechanics, improvised solutions, and men who transform stubbornness into ingenuity. And sometimes, what begins as an armored tractor built out of stubbornness ends up saving lives half a world away. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment telling us what you thought. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories from World War II. True stories of courage, intelligence, and decisions that changed the course of history. Until next time.